to win rallies, but it's kind of been a while. You want to build a rad new race car, but you don't got a lot of clams in the casino currently. You look around at what you already got sitting around the garage and have a couple drinks with your buddy who's got some crazy ideas. And then you say, let's do it. Let's put the engine in the back of this thing, put a turbo on it. This is everything you need to know to get up to speed on the Renault 5 Turbo. I saw one at a Starbucks 3 years ago and it was one of the best days of my life. It was Europe, it was the early 70s, and the most popular car in France was the humble Renault 5 hatchback, also known as the R5 and the 5. Americans knew it as the Renault Le Car, which the French thought was just ridiculous because they don't even call cars cars. Ce sont des voitures, you silly Americans. I am a sexually aggressive skunk. But it didn't matter what anyone called it anywhere. Americans did not like it, and the French loved it, like eating snails. The Renault 5 popularized a new subcompact class in cars in Europe called Super Minis. They were bigger than a Mini, but smaller than a compact car like the Ford Escort. When the 1973 global oil crisis hit, you ever heard of it? We mentioned it a lot. The Super Mini sales took off. Meanwhile, also in 1973, Renault won the very first official WRC Constructors' Championship with their sporty little Renault A110. Then Lancia came along the next year with the purpose-built Ferrari-powered STRATOS and trounced everybody for the next 3 seasons. To learn more about that, watch this episode. The A110 was already a pretty old design when it won, so it wasn't a big shock that the STRATOS stole its thunder. But Renault didn't have anything else in the barn that would stand a chance against Lancia in Group 4, so they settled for selling regular Renault 5s to regular folks. In fact, they sold 1 million 5s in the first 12 years. With sales going strong, in 1976, Renault launched one of the first hot hatches, the Renault 5 Alpine. The non-Alpine R5 models had tiny little inline-4 engines making insane horsepower numbers. Like insanely not a lot. Like 55 not at all buff horses. But the new Renault 5 Alpine got a relatively huge, by comparison, 1.4 liter engine putting down a respectable 93 horsepower. It had obvious rally potential, so Renault homologated it for WRC's Group 2 class. French drivers Jean Ragnati and Guy Flaclin grabbed 3 impressive podium finishes with the hotted up Alpine in 1978 against much faster Group 4 cars. While the Alpines were racing, Renault was already working on building something a little bit more extra. Jean Terramorsi, Renault's VP of production, asked for a small, lightweight Group 4 rally car based on an existing Renault production car. Something that wouldn't need a ton of modifications in order to keep costs down. Bertone designer Marc Deschamps produced a pretty radical idea. Why don't we make a mid-engine rear-wheel drive version of the utilitarian four-wheel drive Renault 5? Mid-engine worked out well for Lancia, so why not? It was a little bit more drastic than Terramorsi originally wanted, but the idea was just too good to not sign off on anyway. Kind of like the KSI versus Logan Paul boxing match. Terramorsi sadly passed away later that year, but his successor, Henry Lerm, L-H-E-R-M, was just as excited about the project and made sure it happened. Most of Renault's racing division was busy with F1 and Grand Prix cars, so only 4 engineers were assigned to work on the new rally prototype called Project 822 at their Alpine factory. A whole space frame chassis would have been ideal, but it would have totally blown the budget. So they cut a hole in the rear floor pan of a Renault R5 and built a tubular frame around it to cradle the future engine and transmission. To install an engine where the back seat used to be and add a 5-speed, they had to expand the R5's rear track by a whole 10 inches. That's like how big my hands are. What'd you think I was gonna say?
I bet I totally thought you were gonna say your dick.
The stock rear torsion bar springs were also in the way, so they were replaced with double wishbones and coil springs. That allowed the car to have the same wheelbase on both sides. That's a weird little factoid about the regular R5 and its predecessor, the Renault 4. The wheelbase was more than an inch longer on the right side than the left to accommodate the suspension design. For power, they considered a bunch of different engine options. A 2.6 liter V6, a 2 liter inline 4, a turbo 1.6, but those were either too heavy, too long. Your homegirl Goldilocks knows those feels. I'm talking about porridge, baby. I'm talking about porridge in bed. It's too soft, too hot. Ultimately, the team settled on putting a Garrett T3 turbo on the existing R5 Alpine's 1.4 four-cylinder. Using the larger 1.6 liter engine would have bumped the car into a higher class, but using the 1.4 would put it in a more competitive position. It was a simple solution, so they gave the car a simple name as well, the Renault 5 Turbo. Even by late 70s standards, the engine was really nothing special. Bosch K-Jetronic mechanical fuel injection, which sucks, replaced the Alpine model's carburetor. It only had 2 valves per cylinder and didn't even have overhead cams. The internals were buffed up like a horse a bit, and compression was dropped so it could run 13 pounds of boost. An air-to-air intercooler was mounted next to the taillights in distinctive new rear fender flares. The visual aspect that makes this car so cool. Marcello Gantini drew up the R5's turbo's final design. That's the same guy from Bertoni who penned the STRATOS, the Lamborghini Miura, and the Ferrari Dino 308 GT4, just to name a few. But this car had to be based on the modest Renault 5 Alpine, so it looked less the part of an aerodynamic race car and more the part of a lumpy, squarish bunny. What mattered more was that all that new sick stuff added a lot of weight. But not to worry, the R5 Turbo had a turbo! The prototype was a hodgepodge of parts from various Alpine and Renault models, so it took 2 years to sort out the R5 Turbo's kinks for production. When it finally went on sale in the summer of 1980, the street versions were pushing 162 horsepower and about the same torques, making it the most powerful French car in production at the time. That was good for a 7-second 0 to 60 and a top speed of 125 miles per. For twice the price of a regular Renault 5, you could get a turbocharged backseat driver singing right in your ear instead of a kid screaming, "I have to use the bathroom, mother. Please, can we stop and buy some cigarettes?" The gas tank was bigger and the dash was full of gauges. Paint choices were a patriotic red or blue. The interior had a bat crazy red and blue color scheme and striped upholstery designed by a guy named Yves Cool. I'm not even making that up. The dude's name was Cool. There was also plush carpeting over the top of the engine cover in a feeble attempt to protect your hearing from the motor's 90 decibel full throttle wail just inches from your ears. Group 4 rally versions of the R5 Turbo made more boost and around 250 horsepower. Street and race versions both had peaky power bands, which made them a handful to drive. They were light and super agile, but when the boost kicked in, boy, you better watch yourself. The engine in the middle made their big little badonkadonk step right out like a Porsche 911, and ultra fast hands were needed to keep things from spinning out of control. But WRC drivers were pretty good at the whole out thing, and that made the Renault 5 Turbo a huge hit with the fans. Besides the factory-backed rally cars, Renault also sold 20 competition-prepped R5 Turbos per year, and a kit that anyone could buy to turn their production model into a rally machine. Its WRC debut was at the Tour de Corsa in the fall of 1980, and to Renault's surprise, 6 other R5 Turbos were entered in the rally by private teams. They'd come up with a car that got people excited to go racing. The factory-supported car driven by Jean Ragnati quit with alternator problems, but privateer BRUNO SABY finished 4th. Renault got their first win at the 1981 WRC season opener, where the R5 Turbo was perfectly suited to the tight tarmac switchbacks of Rally Monte Carlo. Unfortunately, the Audi Quattro showed up to the party that same season wearing all-wheel drive. And the wildly loose rules of Group B followed soon after that. The Renault 5 Turbo won again at the paved Tour de Corsa in 1982, but being only rear-wheel drive meant it could never go as fast in the dirt. It might not have been able to play with the big kids all the time, but its show-off style and big hips still made it one of the cool kids. Meanwhile, racer Patrick Jacquemart, the head of Renault Sport in the US, spearheaded an attempt to get Renault into road racing in North America. In 1981, he brought a highly modified Renault Le Car Turbo to the IMSA Series GTU class and had some good results. The efforts didn't go any further after he crashed while testing and sadly passed away. But his accident directly led to the development of head and neck support devices, the Hans device, which are now practically mandatory safety equipment in every form of professional racing. Renault sold 1,820 R5 turbos before revising a few things to make the production cars cheaper in 1982. The Renault 5 Turbo 2 gave up its colorful interior for beige and swapped out aluminum panels for steel, but it kept similar performance and came in more paint colors, which is cool. Renault sold 3,167 Turbo 2s to the public, so fewer than 5,000 total lumpy French bunnies ever hit the streets. The original turbos' lower production numbers and lighter weight made it the most desirable R5. And don't confuse these guys with the flareless front-engine Renault 5 GT Turbo. That is a whole different thing. Back in WRC in '83, Renault was forced to revise the suspension on the rally cars to meet Group B regulations. And that did not go very well. By 1984, they were focused more on smaller events, and after finishing third at the Tour de Corsa, they dropped out of the rest of the WRC season. It didn't make sense to keep going the way things were. It was time to put some fire back in the Renault R5 Turbo. Maxi Turbo! Renault built their Group B Challenger with a more responsive 1.5-liter engine making 350 horsepower, an aerodynamic front air dam, and a big old honking rear wing, more suspension travel, an aluminum roof, and even wider hips to cover fatter rear tires on 16-inch wheels. In 1985, the R5 Maxi Turbo debuted in the WRC at its predecessor's favorite stomping grounds, the Tarmac Tour de Corsa. Jean Ragnardi led the whole rally and gave Renault their first WRC win in 3 years. But with no plans to head into all-wheel drive territory, the company decided to pull the plug on WRC efforts at the end of the season. And they stopped making the mid-engine hot hatch in 1986. But that didn't stop others from racing the tails off the scrappy little bunny. Future WRC champion Carlos Sainz started to make a name for himself behind the wheel of a Maxi Turbo. And future F1 driver Eric Comas won the 1987 European Super Production Touring Car Championship in one. Besides racing, the Renault 5 Turbo's big booty and bizarre backseat engine also scored it some sick pop culture cameos. The female villain slides around a red Turbo 2 in the 1983 James Bond movie Never Say Never Again. And Bulma drives an R5 Turbo on Dragon Ball. But I bet you freaking nerds already knew that, didn't you? Little geeks. Thanks for watching Up to Speed. Hit that like button. It really helps us out. It really helps us out. Please just take the time to do it. Follow me on Instagram at James Pumphrey. Follow Donut on Instagram at Donut Media. Check out this sick shirt. I designed it. It's available at donutmedia.com. Check out this episode. Check out this episode.
I love you.